go towards, number one, countries with fragile and weak infrastructures. These looks like countries in which individuals have lack accessibility to, for example, go to schools, or maybe these individuals have a problem of food insecurity. This means that these individuals are likely to be people who are suffering from extreme poverty. So you will look at countries such as maybe countries within the African region, or maybe you look at countries such as within the Middle Eastern region, or even the third world countries within Asia as well. I want to now frame what the governments within these countries now look like. Within this looks like two things. Number one, which is that countries within these governments are likely to be corrupted. This means that the full scale of the resources are usually not go towards the people on the ground. Secondly, is that the governments within these countries are often unstable, and this means as a result, the governments itself are constantly shifting. This means that even if you assume the best case that these governments are not corrupted, we think that therefore, because of the shifting governments as a result of instability, the pipeline of money towards the people are often changing, and therefore are not constantly to the most efficient and streamlined to the people on the ground. Next, what does development aid look like? We think development aid is just a pool of resources that is often funded by developed nations with an objective to usually alleviate poverty towards poorer countries and regions. This can be this is usually a foreign development aid. It can just be any form of organization or any countries that wishes to do so. Before that, I'll take one.
How exactly all developing nations in the world are so corrupted and so unstable when Malaysia still have a good institution and still have good economic structure?
So obviously you should adjudicate this debate where the most extent of development aid is likely to go. So on a comparative, you compare countries like Malaysia and Afghanistan. Obviously, if I were to give development aid, I'll give it to Afghanistan and not to Malaysia. Next, what are the problems therefore with opposition's world? We think this looks like two things. We assume the best case, that these governments are benevolent, that these governments for some reason really want to alleviate poverty, even though in our frame we told you that's not true. We think that there is still a huge time lag when this development aid is received by states versus when it is finally received and benefited for the people on the ground. This is because the nature of democracy itself slows things down. This looks like having parliament proceedings. This looks like having months, years to have to draft out a policy to allow these states to decide where this development aid go. So by the time this development aid is being brought to the people on the ground, you often have to adapt to the changing nuances such as inflation, such as whether these aids are actually targeted towards the people and whether these people already still need it at the end of the day. I want to note that secondarily is that democracy necessitates that people vote, and when the government is voted out, even if assume the best case that you already have a perfect policy that's going to use your development aid to the best, note that the next incoming government is not bound to follow that policy. This means that number one, the nature of you drafting a policy or to ensure that development aid goes through is one that is short-termist and one that is only viewed in the lens of the current ruling government. Secondly, it's that because the next government is not bound to follow, this means it leads to a wastage of resources in the beginning when you decide where this development aid goes to. Second, we think that therefore is that this development aid is something that's neutral and ought to be used for benevolent purposes to alleviate poverty. The problem is that when you go through the government pipeline, it is often used as a means of political traction. This means that this development aid is susceptible to political agenda. For example, we think that states are more likely than not to want to funnel this development aid through their stronghold states towards the poorest of the majoritarian group and sidelining the minorities. This was like in Malaysia, when a lot of the time the development aid goes to the Malays, such as your Bree. This means your minorities such as your Orang Asli, such as your Chinese, your Indians, are therefore naturally sidelined because there's no incentive for the government to do so. Also secondarily is that the political incentives of these kinds of governments, right? This was like Afghanistan, where we think that if you provide development to Afghanistan, they're not going to use it to try to increase the quality of life of women, rather it will go towards their extremist religious radical ideals, trying to build more religious institutions. Next, what is the comparative on our side? First, I want to prove how it will be done well even though the motion already assumes feasibility. Which is that how the way it will work is that people who work within this development aid organization or people who are just working under these things will gain information and data to determine who and where to help within these countries via either either relying or collaborating with think tanks and NGOs that exist within their countries in itself. Out of note here that these think tanks and NGOs in the status quo are not politically affiliated. Even if there exists those that are politically affiliated, we think naturally these people who are under development aid won't work with those instead. We think that these think tanks and NGOs are observers of the countries. They are one who are most proximate to the nuances and livelihoods of the people. They know who exactly are the ones that actually need help. They often are not focused on the problem statement of the country. They focus on those that are already being sidelined by the same institution in itself. Therefore, the nature of this information is likely one to be more perfect and likely one to be more better to be used on compared to theirs. Second is that the process of development aid looks like that when you use states as a middleman, this means that your nature of accountability to asking these institutions for updates are going to be one of an opaque process, because states are not obliged to give you updates on where they are using their development aid, because states are also not obliged to also tell you where they want to put this development aid. This means that you often have to rely on states for any form of good change. If they want to do bad things, it's very hard for you to call out insofar as the harm has already been done. The comparative is very simple, which is that we have a direct line of control of where these resources go. This is like having a more autonomous and transparent process. This means that we are better able to adapt. If in the short term we put development aid in the wrong area, because of the transparent process, we can immediately adapt and now shift the development aid fast at the absence of the bureaucratic process towards the people who are most vulnerable. The impact of it is very simple, which is that number one, we have speed. Note that urgency is very important because people's livelihoods are at stake. One money wasted on one life, any money wasted on opposition side is one life lost and one future of a children lost. We win on efficiency as well because we have transparency. You can shift the resource accordingly based on what is most needed. And lastly, we also win on the scale of vulnerability. We go towards the people that need it the most.
The problem with Eunsi's speech is that she assumes that this debate is about humanitarian aid, but at the same time also not providing any analysis on why people on the ground have much better capacity to make better decisions. And best all we hear is that government suck on some degrees. This is not going to my speech. First, framing on what development aid actually looks like. Then followed by argument on like why government is the best act to make this decision based on good information. But second, why it's much easier to hold government accountable. And last part is why targeted development is much more preferable on our side, and I think it's only exclusive on our side because government never implements now. Let's start with framing, right? One, like I said earlier, this is not about humanitarian aid. Like, i.e., if your people have problem with food or people have problem with like things like food security, then you already have humanitarian aid to follow deal with that. This debate is about development aid that tries to develop the country further. I.e., to say that people giving this development aid come from few things. One, either a subsidies from perhaps the European Union giving agricultural subsidies towards countries in the EU. Second, it looks like how you ask loan. How even Malaysia asks loans from like the WTO or the World Bank or even the IMF with no interest, or even things like how you can do like cash transfers for a favor by like things like lowering tariffs and all, right? Just like favors and all. The bottom line to all of this framing, please sit down. Please sit down, The whole point of this framing is that all of this aid comes with conditions. I have to say that at the point at which you are unable to show some level of development, or your development starts to stagnate even with this aid, then this aid likely going to stop towards these quote-unquote states, and I think it just makes much more horrible towards the people on the ground. Then how are we going to use this, right? I think that development aid is better to be used to develop the economic sector, i.e. increasing the amount of facilities, increasing the number of schools so that you can build your human capital and knowledge. Second, it looks like increasing businesses and factories to create more jobs for the people on the ground so that they can sustain themselves. And number third, creating companies so that you can increase the amount of like just like trading, things about like money flowing into the state, and also just people having more purchasing power and all, right? And I want to make clear is that the key difference between like the government and the people on the ground is that the government has strategies, and I think they have better capacity to make better strategies, and I'll flesh this out. As long as we can prove to you that the money, the duration is like controlled by the government in a very good way, and I think at the point at which they can decide the best things for the people on the ground, and I think that's much more preferable towards the stakeholders that they want to claim, right? I want to also further add on that the reason why this aid is important for people on the ground is that that country current national revenue, like what Eunsi said, is currently not enough. At the point at which they have stagnancy because of lack of commercial activity, lack of people with income, lack of a lot of people are highly dependent on the state and all. That's why you need the aid to get people out of this stagnancy, out of this stagnant bubble, right? So first argument that out of the way, why is government like if we agree, or if we both agree that we can't guarantee that both actors, either the government or the people on the ground, can make good decisions. But we think that on a whole idea of scale, government can make much better decisions. But number two, it's easy to hold accountable. Let's start first with like the first part on why is it that government make better decisions. First part, information. I think that when government make decisions on how to use this development aid, they will consult with people like economic experts, finance experts to make the best decisions. And those kind of information also extend towards things like sociology, figuring out how many hospitals do you need in this rural area, how many jobs do you need in order to just make sure that this particular part of this country is doing pretty well. And I want to take note, it's very important here that there's a lot of already all these experts in developing country, or at least the people who are working in these governments already have this knowledge and all, right? So even if political parties change, the people working in the Ministry of Finance, working in the Ministry of Health, still around the same people. So even if the people on the top change, the ideas and the policy making still the same. So I'm sure why the claim from Nancy coming through that it's only short-term policy. The bottom line is simple. I think that government have better capacity to make decisions. And the problem is that in government's world, on a comparative level, the information is not spread unequally. If they agree education sucks in this country, that means some people have better financial knowledge, some people don't know what to do with this money, and that means that the decisions that you make then will also be not like messed up across the board. Even in their best case, where people on the ground make good decisions, they only know the decisions that can help them on a financial level or on a microeconomic level. Meaning, I know best how to build a business for myself, but unsure whether this business is one that the country needs in order to propel it forward for like the future generations or to actually build up the country. This is really important by now, because at the point at which I'll do later. The whole point of this is that I think on idea of the probability, I think it's much easier to prove that on government side, the government has on upside that the government has the better capacity to make this decision, right? But so now we settle on why they better decision making. Now let's talk on the second half of the debate, which is accountability. Well, how even in worst cases where both of them make bad decisions, we still have better accountability. How does this look like? One, I think people on the ground, like what Enzi said, can vote. So if they are unable to see any development, and they know that if they're not going to get development, then the aid is going to stop, then people are going to call that out. They're going to push out people for the government. And even if that process takes too long, and then you don't see any change, you can do things like protest, or like you can do things like go out the streets and like call out your government. And the thing is that governments need to curb this protest. They need to spend more money to curb this protest, whether like to invest in like the National Guard, get more police to like do all of these things, right? And I think even in the worst cases, where Enzi agrees that, or at least Enzi wants to debate in a world where, it's just like corrupted states only, then sure, we can still take that and we just say that these corrupt politicians still care because they need the development aid to fill their own pockets. But number two, so that means that even in cases where like they have to like spend money to do protest, they rather just try to save their money by actually developing the country. This looks like even in dictatorships like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, and how the minister goes to build Singapore looking better than Malaysia. No offense. But before I go on to like the comparative, okay, take a deal right now.
Yeah, you see that people can only make micro decisions and it's not good for the state. Why is this true?
What position?
If people make micro decisions for their stability, why is this bad?
I explained this already in my speech on how on the macro level you are able to get this change because of the uneven spread of knowledge. Please listen to my speech again. Last point, on how even if both sides make great decisions, there's only a ceiling on the level of outcome that you can get. Problem, panel, economics of scale dictate that in order for you to build schools and build all of these big infrastructures that Enzi wants, you need to concentrate resources. You need all the schools and businesses that I mentioned earlier. The problem is that the barrier of entry to develop and establish the school first is very expensive. But once those schools already exist and once those institutions exist, then the money that you need to sustain that is much less on our side, because you just have to keep upgrading and it doesn't need to take less money. The reason why this last part is a debate-winning argument is that the economics of scale is one that is only exclusive on our side, and that means that the economic development is much more preferable on our side. We think that also looks like how you can have better targeted development. If government understand that this part of the country is rural and it needs more hospital, they understand that this part look very good for businesses, so then you can make things like Silicon Valley. So government knows this better, and that means that the wealth spread is much more equitable, and that's something that they have to engage with. Not finance, give money to governments, not to people.
I like how charitable Rashrvin is, because for some reason every citizen in their countries are so benevolent, so smart at making decisions. For us, we have to defend corrupted state, North Korea, Afghanistan and Iran. You know what? For the sake of worst case debating, I'll just take it. let's perhaps, maybe it's true that we have to defend North Korea. My first question then becomes, why suddenly on that side of the house, the citizens of North Korea are able to actually use this money properly when they're also being controlled by their own countries and also their own state, which means their ability are also being controlled. If they say it's so corrupted, why can't the government just directly take the money from the people on the ground and just not give it in the first place? But second and more importantly, most likely, even if like it has to be about like North Korea and also Iran and Afghanistan using this money, I still think that to an extent, in order for them to actually have the most amount of money for themselves, they need to make sure that the country is somewhat like super like self-sufficient, and that means that they're able to actually develop their country in a way that gives them more money in the future. The conclusion here is simple. In order for their selfish interest to actually be fully utilized, they needed to be able to develop the country to an extent in order to get some form of economic revenue in the future. If not, they will lose out. Here's the problem with this team. Because one, they never explain to you about why exactly then in a lot of situations these people can actually make the best decision, especially when we explain to you there's a lot of reasons. But two, and this is where it's very important, they lack the explanation as to why exactly that the way that the development aid works doesn't really exist on that side of the house. Because the biggest problem on that side of the house is that they do not understand how exactly development aid works. It's not just a simple free money that you are given. In a lot of situations, there are conditions and loans that you have to take on, which means that you have to give some form of like condition that you need to fulfill, or you need to give some form of return back to, like for example, the loan that you take from IMF or like the AIIB or like the WTO. Why that is very, very important then? Because insofar as on that side of the house, the people on the ground are the one who are actually making the best decision. That means that this organization cannot really guarantee that they're able to get the conditions that they want, or they're able to get the return that it is needed. So IMF do not think that Indonesia can actually pay back if all the money goes to the citizen rather than to the people, to the state, because the state can't really give that guarantee, because the state cannot really control the people on the ground. Why then this is very, very harmful? Because there's a lack of guarantees that this country can give. All of these organizations have to rely on other form of like information to actually be able to ensure that they're able to actually fulfill this. And the most situation, they rely on the credit score of these countries. Why exactly this is very, very harmful? Because on that side of the house, they say all these countries are poor, all these countries are corrupted. Guess what? If that's true, all these countries also have a very horrible credit score, which means the ability for them to get this development aid are also very limited in nature. Which means the countries who have the highest amount of that like credit score are the only one who actually can get development aid. Insofar as they say that these countries needed to be able to alleviate all the poverty, we explain to you why exactly the amount of development aid on that side of the house will be limited. On our side of the house, we at least have a lot more development aid because the governments are able to actually use their own policy to actually give some form of condition, or at least give some form of guarantees that they're able to fulfill this. That's why Indonesia are able to get these resources in the first place. The second thing I just want to discuss that I'll take you in a bit is that I'm not entirely sure why exactly on that side of the house suddenly like all the governments are actually going to do good things. Because notice here, right? Perhaps government is right. Most states are actually short-termist and also populist. My first question is that why exactly the comparative is better? I'm not sure why exactly the people are not selfish and also short-termist as well, for a few reasons. The first is because of how exactly their perspective is very limited. So perhaps I think that what I'm doing right now is the best thing for like my own community, when in reality it's actually only fulfilling my own self. But more importantly, I do not know what exactly other community wants to do, which means that my ability to develop the areas are only limited to within my own areas rather than the whole country as a whole. Secondly, their priority is different. They say everyone wants to actually survive. Exactly. But the definition of survivability differs from people to people. Some people want clean water, some people want food, some people want to send people to school, some people also want to develop their businesses. Because of these different kinds of like priority, makes it very hard for you to just unionize and also concentrate all your resources to do all these good things. Even if I take them at their best, the problem here then becomes, even if they can build all this new water, they do not think further ahead and think about what exactly the most beneficial for the community in the future. That's why they're going to prioritize things such as like just having good water or having more food without actually explaining about how exactly then they're able to further develop the country, because there's a lack of information in the first place. But thirdly, humans are just selfish in nature. If you give more money to the people, people tend to get blindsided and they focus on things that makes them happy and better right now rather than things that can actually make them better in the future. That's why it's very, very problematic. The second thing I want to talk about is that I think it will be worse on that side of the house, because the current government are reliant on the governmental revenues to do all the short-termist populist on that side of the house. The difference here is that now the amount of money is limited. So the governmental revenue are being used to short-termist populist on that side of the house, whereas the development aid that should have been used for development aid are being given to the people, which means no development are being done by the government. On our side, perhaps the government are doing all this short-termist and populist policy. They're using the government revenue for the populist policy and the governmental aid for the development of the country. That is far beneficial because that means that you're able to get some form of like development in the first place. But thirdly, the populist and short-termist policy that they argue are one that is about giving money to the people. If they're just against populist policy, I'm not sure why exactly that is better on that side of the house. Because for some reason they are against brain and cash transfer to the people, but on that side of the house suddenly they say it's a good thing on that side of the house because people are smart. Pick one. Is it bad? Or is it people are not smart enough to make the decision, or smart enough to make the decision? Fourthly, it's about the instability of the changing, but sure.
You seem to have a difficulty in understanding aid. Your frame is hinges on the capacity of giving loan, where there's condition, where there's splits on. When people give aid, it's for the most vulnerable countries. Obviously, if you are messed up, you can't give aid to countries who can't pay back.
Go read developmental aid by IMF and you'll understand why exactly it has to be loaned. IMF doesn't directly give developmental aid without any guarantee, but even if that's the case, why would they give a guarantee, give a loan, give an aid without guarantee that your country is going to develop in the first place, right? Finally, it's about the instability of changing that they want to argue, right? They say there's a gap that exists. Number one, I want to point out that this is very unnuanced. Why? Because in reality, it's that a lot of people, the government, firstly, they already can use the old policy that exists in the first place in order to actually continue doing these things. The reason why they are unlikely to change is because people are dependent on it, which means that if you decided to pull out this policy, a lot of people are going to riot, which means more often than not, they have to pick and choose the policy that they are going to withdraw. So I agree with them. Maybe there are some governments who will change their policy, but it is not likely going to be the policy that harms the development because they know that it will affect the way that they're able to survive. But secondly, even if it's short-termist in nature, I think that's still a good thing. Because within that span of 5 years, you can do a lot of things. You can build a lot of schools, you can build a lot of hospitals. All of these things are benefits that you can use for the rest of your countries, which means that you're able to benefit the country further. Because all of these people require this concentration of resources in order for them to be able to actually develop these things. Because it's more expensive to build hospital rather than upgrading hospital. On our side of the house, once you have those hospitals and schools, you are able to continue further developing. On that side of the house, there's no guarantee they have the hospital and the school. For all those reasons, it is clear we're winning.
Panel, the only way team opposition can win is in a world where you believe that the multiverse is true. Because the way in which they describe the world to you is extremely weird. It's only within their world you can build hospitals. It's only within their world you can build schools. But somehow, Gulf has to defend purely cash handouts. I think this is firstly insensitive to the earlier frame coming out from NC that the development aid that we talk about can exist in building schools, can exist in building water pumps or infrastructure. This is very clear and linear through two speeches. For those reasons, it is not Gulf's burden to say, aha, money is the only way we can help these individuals. But I'll deal with that later. One thing I want to do, a few things I want to deal with before I move on to elections, is to generally deal with the DLO speech. Because DLO's attempt within this debate is to explain to you that governmental structures are great, that governmental structures are the thing as to why we're good. But I'm going to point to you why this is a tension and clearly fits into the frame that NC tells you. Let's point out one thing they said verbatim, right? Which is the idea about governmental revenue and how it's oftentimes the way in which they operate on policies. Because this proves one very correct thing, that government's priorities are constantly divided. That means they are unable to prioritize a one niche industry, but choose as to a holistic plan to how they develop the state. This proves sufficiently that you are unable to have the ROI that you talk about. When they talk about receipts, and I'm dealing here about the returns that these developmental banks, okay, they want to talk about developmental banks and developmental aid. Sure, I think it's not just IMF, multiple different entities. But sure, if they want to talk about IMF so much and they receive the IMF request, the problem here is that the IMF oftentimes get opaque receipts, opaque answers, and they oftentimes are uncertain. They just tell you, yeah, okay, these are how things have changed, but not proof as to the process. The comparative was clear, infers by the way, about how when developmental aid is able to get a clear, transparent link towards those processes. When they're able to have autonomy over how those processes look like, is when they get better, when they're able to implement better policies towards different regions. For example, they can learn from mistakes that happened when developmental aid was brought into certain communities or regions. Or they can fine-tune certain policies. All this requires a unique form, which is the ability to control the autonomy around those policies. Something they're insensitive to. But secondly, what's this idea around survivability is different between people. Some people are smart, some people are stupid, some people just want different things. If that's true, then why does the government have ultimate force and authority over deciding what's good for you? This means it's bad, because governments oftentimes take decisions that don't really care about you.
how many governments actually know what the people on the ground want. Especially if you buy that frame, that people all have different needs, that means the government can't cater to all different needs. If you want us to defend the burden of a variety of solutions, it's only within the ability to have the aid directly deal with these people that allows for that variety of solutions. Later, Haikal. But lastly then, let's just move on to clash and really deal with what this debate is. Because the first thing that you need to note is the principle of developmental aid. This was very clear and unchallenged. That developmental aid is about absorbing poverty. It's about access towards infrastructure, education, healthcare. All these things are true. For those very reasons, let's then deal with the spectrum. And here's where I move to the clash and about charitability. If it's true that governments are good, we have explained within ENC, in the most perfect of democracies, that the reality of democracy is how time lag is the true concept. No matter how good your government is, oftentimes policies require time for them to be enacted. So the aid comes in now. 5 years later, the aid comes out. That's how governments work. Even in the most benevolent of governments, and they don't filter out those money, that money still takes time for people to understand. The comparative is, when development aid is able to tackle people on the ground, they send in the money today, tomorrow they work towards building those schools. Tomorrow they work towards building their infrastructure. That was the first push that they didn't deal with. But the second thing, this proves that if you buy the frame that true, development aid oftentimes targets regions which are more unstable. This means governments have fallibilities. If it's true that governments are fallible, that's where those harms compound and become worse. I'll take them best case, I wouldn't even deal with the worst case for them, because I think they need to deal with it themselves. But the second thing, even if they're great, governments work in short-termist policies. The reason is simple. Election cycles, panel. You constantly have a new government in the next 5 years. These are things that prove governments will always choose political or populist policies in order to ensure their power. That means that the help that you want and the aid that you want, even if it goes through, are probably access to the majoritarian. Guys, I'm repeating NC's speech. This is damn annoying. They need to listen to my first. But third thing then, is necessarily how those things change on the lives of the people, especially about political affiliation. Why this is different? Because when governments are able to hop onto the idea, this is me, I'm the one helping you, vote me into the next election, it is a bad thing. Because this development aid was never their money to begin with, was never taxpayers' money, it was more towards greatening their identity and their perspective. You are entrenching a government that is bad or good, doesn't matter, it's horrible because you give this political money and this is blood money you're talking about. Sure, Haikal.
If you're saying that all government is bad and everyone is good, why not just let everyone make all the economic decisions for the country rather than just the government?
Brother, I explained to you very clearly that if governments are good, it's still bad because of how government structures work. They are not responding to this. It's very strawman for them to argue that we're only forcing them to defend unstable governments. We're telling you on the spectrum, if it's good, it's still bad. If it's bad, it's worse. That's what they need to do with. Don't strawman the goddamn argument. Let's talk about processes and how this necessarily looks like. I think it is the process that changes things definitively. Necessarily, the impact to the ground via this process. It's simple to understand why processes vastly change on both sides of the house. Because the arbiters of those processes on their side is the government. They need to defend that governments will always have the best interests of those individuals. Even in those best interests, there is still a problem by virtue of how long it takes, etc. Cool. But secondly, it's the most important thing, which is opacity. The ability for governments to shield behind different policies and different ideas and different ideals and different wants and needs. That opacity means that you oftentimes don't see those needs translated on the ground. If development aids, and they talk about this idea of check and balance, they say you can always protest against the government, but it's such a workaroundy way. Why are you going through the process of fighting the government if things are wrong, etc.? We could directly handle the goddamn problem. Build the schools, build the water pumps, build the goddamn hospitals. Those are direct ways in which people can instantly feel those impacts. So it's very clear, if you don't buy any of those strategies I've sold to you, it's just as simple as weighing out the impact. Our impact is simple. You can tangibly see these processes without a political entity or an affiliation. Theirs will always be tied to an identity and always be tied to a good government. On this spectrum, they constantly lose.
Faster doesn't mean better. Autonomy is not absolute. Their first push is to explain as to why countries and they will actually be able to allow faster processes, and the reason is because they don't have to go through bureaucracy. I just want to point out the problem with their case, right? Because for some reason they think that bureaucracy is immediately bad because it's going to take a very long time for fast. But it also kind of contradicts their argument about short-termism, because they say that for some reason like we're going to pass a lot of things in short term, but for some reason we're also going to delay it very long. So which one is it? Is it that people are going to prioritize making visible things within the 5 years, or they're going to wait until that 5 years end for them to actually make changes to which they cannot really explain? But second, more importantly, is that a lot of the things that we explain down the patch is that things such as budget hearing, things such as building school, and all of those things are bipartisan, and more importantly is that a lot of people are going to support regardless, which means that we're still going to have it, and it's still going to happen, and it's very, very fast, maybe not fast, but relatively fast in comparison, right? Because on that side of the house, the problem that they haven't mechanized is how exactly are you going to unionize people? Because it's harder for you to unionize people when there's no common platform for you to be able to like unionize them. On our side of the house, we do that through democracy and through election, which is why people can actually talk to each other. But on that side of the house, they have to rely on the incentive of the people to directly talk to each other and say, we want clean water, or we want better road, or we want to build school, or we want to build more businesses, to which there's no guarantee that it could happen. You have to judge them based on the probability of these things could happen in the first place. But secondly, more importantly, I'm not sure why exactly development is unlikely going to happen in the country. If the development aid requires the government to actually ask the development aid first, why exactly then the government will hold on to those money rather than building or using those money in the first place wasn't clear coming from that side of the house. Second thing they argue is about autonomy. They say that autonomy is good. I'm not entirely sure, because if it's true that autonomy is good, autonomy is not really absolute. Because in a lot of situations, we do know that people make mistakes, or we do know that people tend to make problematic stuff, which is why the government tend to actually step in and make the best decision for them based on the information that they have, because the government has to cater towards every single individual and making sure that everyone are able to get their preferences. Their argument that, well, we want to have preference. If I vote one government and then I do not actually win, if I vote for this politician and they do not actually win, does that mean that my preference is not fulfilled? Not really. The preferences is about making sure that everyone are able to get what is necessary for them. Which means that on that side of the house, there's no reason for them to suggest that autonomy is only fulfilled at the point where you ensure that everyone can do whatever they want. But secondly, more importantly, the autonomy is based on what exactly the outcome it is. So perhaps they are right that we need to actually achieve good things in order for people to achieve better autonomy. But the outcome they do not actually explain on that side of the house is what would happen when people have this autonomy. What we explain to you is that at least people are able to be protected, they're able to get more school and more hospital, because on that side, on our side of the house, the overall development actually exists and that is better. Even when it is corrupted, it is still better on our side of the house, because at least there's a form of like overall holistic developmental that happens within the country. Perhaps it is very corrupted, but at least they have the incentive to develop the country in order to ensure that the country doesn't go to shit. On that side of the house, there's no clear reason as to why exactly that the government or like the people are going to actually do these things. But I explain to you why exactly it's worse, because now all the money that they use for populist and short-termist policy are going to be only by the governmental revenues, which means they have no money for the developmental processes within their country, and that's going to be far, far worse. But we also argue two more things that actually kill that case. The first is we explain to you as to why exactly then you would lose out on the developmental aid, which you receive no response whatsoever coming from government. We explain to you, when you do not have the ability to guarantee that you can actually fulfill this condition or like give back the returns of the loan that you actually take on, you are more likely going to not be able to get this loan in the future, because they look at your credit score and all the poor countries are unlikely to actually be able to actually achieve these things, which means that you are not going to get enough developmental aid, which means all these countries are going to suffer the most. But second and more importantly as well, is about what we explain throughout the batch about why exactly the development is better, and more importantly, especially when we explain to you about why exactly this creates the signaling effect, where a lot of like the countries are able to use this to signal to people to develop within this area and to come and invest within the areas because it's beneficial. This is very beneficial because they cannot achieve that on that side of the house, because there's no guarantee that people can create this signaling effect, but government can, because they're the one who are actually making the policy very publicized and everyone will listen to them, and that's why there is more likely going to create development.